The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Sarah Martinez walked through the main gate, her civilian ID badge clipped to a simple blue blouse. At 28, she had learned to navigate military installations with quiet confidence, though she had never worn a uniform herself. Her role as a trauma counselor brought her to bases across the country, but Naval Amphibious Base Coronado felt different. The weight of history seemed to hang in the salt air, mixed with an intensity she could almost taste. Sarah had built her career working with combat veterans, specializing in cases where traditional therapy had failed. Her unconventional methods and genuine understanding had earned her referrals from military psychologists who respected results over credentials. She carried no rank, held no commission, yet her reputation among those who mattered most, the warriors themselves, spoke louder than any title. The assignment that brought her to Coronado was challenging even by her standards. A Navy SEAL team had returned from a particularly brutal deployment in Afghanistan. 3 members were struggling with severe trauma symptoms that were affecting not just their own mental health, but the entire team's operational readiness. The Navy's standard counseling protocols had proven insufficient, and desperate commanders had reached out to Sarah's civilian practice. Commander Jake Thompson had initially resisted the idea of bringing in outside help. A 15-year veteran of the SEAL teams, he believed in handling problems internally. His men were the elite of the elite, trained to push through pain and overcome any obstacle. The suggestion that they needed a civilian counselor, especially one who had never experienced combat, felt like admitting weakness. However, the situation had grown critical. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, one of his most reliable operators, had begun experiencing severe panic attacks during routine training exercises. Petty Officer First Class David Kim was showing signs of dangerous aggression, picking fights in bars and pushing boundaries with superior officers. Most concerning was Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Johnson, whose 1,000-yard stare had become permanent, and who had stopped speaking entirely except when directly ordered. The team medic, Hospital Corpsman First Class Rachel Chen, had been the first to suggest they needed specialized help. She had seen too many good operators destroyed by invisible wounds, watched promising careers end not from enemy bullets but from battles fought in the mind. When she learned about Sarah's work with other special operations units, she made a direct appeal to Commander Thompson. Sarah's first meeting with the team took place in a sterile conference room that felt more like an interrogation chamber than a therapeutic space. The 3 affected SEALs sat rigid in their chairs, eyes distant, while their teammates flanked them in a show of solidarity. Commander Thompson introduced her with barely concealed skepticism, his tone suggesting this was a formality he was required to endure. "Gentlemen, this is Sarah Martinez. She's here to help with some issues we've been having." His pause before the word help made his feelings clear. "I expect you to give her your full cooperation." Sarah understood immediately that she was walking into hostile territory. These men had been trained to view vulnerability as weakness, to push through pain without complaint. The fact that they were sitting in this room at all represented a failure in their own eyes. Her challenge wasn't just treating their trauma, it was earning the right to try. She began not with questions about their experiences or symptoms, but with respect for their service. Sarah had spent years studying military culture, understanding the bonds that held units together and the pride that sustained them through impossible missions. She spoke to them as warriors first, acknowledging their sacrifices and the weight they carried. "I'm not here to fix you," she said simply. "You're not broken. You've been through things most people can't imagine, and you've carried that weight so others don't have to. I'm here because sometimes even the strongest people need someone who understands what that weight feels like." The shift in the room was subtle but noticeable. Shoulders relaxed slightly. Eyes that had been focused on the far wall began to drift toward her face. Commander Thompson, who had been checking his watch repeatedly, found himself listening more carefully. Sarah's approach was different from anything they had experienced. Instead of clinical questions about sleep patterns and anxiety levels, she talked about brotherhood, about the burden of protecting others, about the difficulty of transitioning from environments where hypervigilance kept you alive to places where it isolated you from normal human connection. Petty Officer Johnson, who hadn't spoken voluntarily in weeks, finally broke his silence. "How would you know?" he asked quietly, his voice rusty from disuse. "You never carried a rifle. You never watched your buddies get shot. How could you possibly understand?" It was the question Sarah had been waiting for, the challenge she knew would come. Her answer would determine whether these sessions would help or become another frustrating exercise in military bureaucracy. "You're right," she replied without defensiveness. "I've never been in combat. I've never had to make split-second decisions that determine who lives and who dies. But I have sat with hundreds of people who have. I've held the hands of Navy SEALs while they cried about friends they couldn't save. I've listened to Army Rangers describe the weight of coming home when their squad mates didn't. I've watched Marine Force Recon operators struggle with the same questions that keep you awake at night." She paused, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "I may not have lived your experiences, but I've lived in their aftermath. I've seen what courage looks like when the adrenaline fades and you're left with the memories. And I've learned that the strongest people are often the ones who suffer the most, because they feel responsible not just for their own survival, but for everyone else's." The room fell silent. Staff Sergeant Santos, who had been shifting restlessly in his chair, stopped fidgeting. Petty Officer Kim's jaw unclenched for the first time since the meeting began. Even Commander Thompson found himself leaning forward slightly, his skepticism beginning to crack. Sarah had passed their first test, but she knew the real work hadn't even begun. These men had survived hell together, and they would either heal together or continue to suffer together. Her job was to show them that seeking help wasn't abandoning their brotherhood, it was strengthening it. As the formal session ended and the SEALs filed out, Commander Thompson lingered behind. His expression had changed from skeptical to cautiously interested. "They actually talked," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Johnson hasn't said more than 10 words in a month, and Santos hasn't sat still for 5 minutes without jumping at shadows." Sarah gathered her materials, careful not to appear too confident. Progress with special operations personnel was often measured in inches, not miles. "They're good men carrying heavy loads," she replied. "Sometimes that load gets too heavy even for SEALs. That doesn't make them weak, it makes them human." As she walked across the base toward her temporary quarters, Sarah reflected on the challenge ahead. She had worked with elite units before, but each team brought its own dynamics, its own wounds, its own resistance to outside help. The coming weeks would test not just her therapeutic skills, but her ability to understand and honor the culture she was trying to help heal. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded everyone on the base of distant conflicts and friends left behind. Sarah understood that her work here would be about more than treating individual symptoms. She would need to help these warriors find a way to carry their experiences without being crushed by them, to honor their fallen friends without drowning in survivors' guilt. The next morning would bring new challenges, new resistance, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of their trust. But tonight, for the first time in months, 3 Navy SEALs would go to sleep knowing that someone outside their brotherhood understood that their struggles didn't diminish their courage. They were simply the price paid for loving something greater than themselves. The breakthrough came during Sarah's 3rd week at Coronado, though it began with what appeared to be a complete failure. She had been working individually with each of the 3 troubled SEALs, making slow but steady progress. Staff Sergeant Santos had begun talking about his panic attacks, describing the crushing sensation that made him feel like he was drowning on dry land. Petty Officer Kim had started acknowledging his anger issues, admitting that he sometimes felt like he was still fighting enemies who weren't there. But it was Marcus Johnson who proved to be the key to everything that followed. The quiet SEAL had gradually opened up about the incident that haunted him, a mission where split-second decisions had saved most of his team but cost the life of his best friend, Petty Officer Tom Bradley. Johnson blamed himself not for making the wrong choice, but for being the one who survived to make choices at all. Sarah had suggested a group session, believing that hearing each other's struggles might help the men realize they weren't alone in their pain. She had arranged to meet them in the team's own space, their equipment bay, rather than the sterile conference room. The familiar surroundings of parachutes, diving gear, and weapons racks should have been comforting, but instead they seemed to trigger something deeper. Johnson had been describing the moment when everything went wrong on that Afghanistan mission. His voice was steady, controlled, but his hands shook as he spoke about the IED explosion that separated him from Bradley, about the impossible choice between pursuing the mission objective and searching for his wounded teammate. "I chose the mission," he said quietly. "Command training kicked in, objective first, personal feelings second. But Tom," his voice broke for the first time since Sarah had known him, Tom was calling for me, I heard him calling, and I chose to complete the mission instead. The other SEALs in the room understood immediately. They had all faced similar moments where duty conflicted with personal loyalty, where the greater good demanded sacrifices that tore at their souls. But understanding didn't make Johnson's pain any less devastating. Santos reached out instinctively to put a hand on Johnson's shoulder, but Johnson recoiled violently. The sudden movement triggered something in Santos, sending him into a panic attack that left him gasping for air. Kim's protective instincts flared, and he stepped forward aggressively, seeing threats everywhere and nowhere at once. In seconds, Sarah's carefully planned therapeutic session had devolved into chaos. 3 highly trained warriors were trapped in a psychological firefight with enemies only they could see. The other team members looked on helplessly, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Sarah moved without thinking, her training taking over just as surely as theirs did in combat. She positioned herself in the center of the room, speaking in a calm, authoritative voice that cut through the panic and confusion. Santos, look at me. You're in California, not Afghanistan. Feel the concrete floor under your feet. This is your space, your team room, you're safe. Her words were simple but delivered with absolute certainty. She turned to Kim without taking her eyes completely off Santos. Kim, I need you to help your teammate. Johnson isn't the enemy, he's your brother. Santos needs you to be his anchor right now, not his protector. The transformation was remarkable. Kim's aggressive posture shifted immediately to protective as he moved to support Santos, helping him regulate his breathing. Johnson, seeing his teammates struggling, found strength he didn't know he still possessed. He moved to Santos's other side, providing the kind of steady presence that had made him an effective operator. We've got you, Miguel, Johnson said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. You're home, you're with your team. Sarah watched as the 3 damaged SEALs instinctively formed a protective triangle, each supporting the others in their moment of crisis. The other team members stepped closer, creating an outer ring of security that was both physical and emotional. Without realizing it, they had demonstrated the very bonds that could heal them. When the immediate crisis passed and breathing returned to normal, the room fell silent. The vulnerable moment had stripped away pretenses and revealed something profound. These men weren't just fellow service members, they were family. Their individual wounds were connected, part of a shared trauma that could only be addressed together. Commander Thompson, who had arrived during the crisis, stood quietly in the doorway. He had seen his men handle combat stress, equipment failures, and impossible missions, but watching them navigate this emotional battlefield with Sarah's guidance revealed something he hadn't fully understood before. The civilian counselor wasn't just treating symptoms, she was helping them remember who they were beneath the trauma. Maybe we should continue this later, Thompson suggested, concerned about pushing his men too hard. But Johnson surprised everyone, including himself. No, sir, we need to finish this conversation. He looked around at his teammates, then back to Sarah. We've been carrying this alone for too long. If we're going to get better, we need to do it together. Sarah nodded, recognizing the moment for what it was, a turning point where the team chose healing over hiding. She had seen it before with other units, the instant when warriors realized that supporting each other through psychological wounds required the same courage they showed in physical combat. The conversation that followed was unlike any therapy session Sarah had ever conducted. The SEALs began sharing not just their individual traumas, but the ways those experiences connected them. Santos talked about how his panic attacks were triggered not just by loud noises, but by feeling isolated from his team. Kim admitted that his anger was rooted in fear that he couldn't protect the people he cared about from invisible threats. Johnson's revelation was the most powerful. I keep thinking that if I had chosen differently, Tom would be here instead of me, but sitting here now, watching you guys struggle, I realized that Tom would want me to take care of you. He'd want me to be present for my team, not lost in guilt about choices I can't change. The other team members contributed their own perspectives, sharing how they had been affected by watching their brothers suffer. Hospital corpsman Chen talked about the helplessness of being able to treat physical wounds, but not psychological ones. The team leader spoke about the responsibility he felt for his men's well-being both in combat and at home. Sarah facilitated carefully, helping them recognize patterns and connections they couldn't see individually. She showed them how Johnson's withdrawal had affected Santos's sense of security, how Santos's panic had triggered Kim's protective aggression, how Kim's anger had reinforced Johnson's guilt about being a burden to his team. "You've been fighting separate battles," she explained, "but you're really facing the same war. The enemy isn't your memories or your symptoms, it's the isolation that makes you feel like you have to face those memories alone." As the session progressed, Sarah watched something beautiful unfold. These warriors began applying their tactical training to their emotional struggles. They identified triggers the way they would identify threats, developed response strategies like they would plan missions, and established support protocols that mirrored their combat procedures. Santos suggested a buddy system for managing panic attacks, pairing each affected team member with a partner who could provide grounding techniques. Kim proposed regular check-ins where team members could honestly assess each other's mental state without judgment. Johnson, finding his voice again, recommended that they honor their fallen friends not through guilt, but through commitment to taking care of each other. Commander Thompson found himself drawn into the conversation, sharing his own struggles with command responsibility and the weight of making decisions that affected others' lives. The artificial barrier between officer and enlisted, between leader and follower, dissolved as they recognized their common humanity. By the end of the extended session, the team had developed what Sarah would later describe as a psychological battle plan, a comprehensive approach to supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of processing combat trauma. They had transformed their pain from a source of isolation into a foundation for deeper connection. As they prepared to leave, Johnson approached Sarah privately. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not for fixing us, we're not broken, but for helping us remember that we don't have to carry everything alone." Sarah watched them file out together, moving with the synchronized purpose that marked elite units. They were still wounded, still struggling, but they were no longer fighting alone. The healing process would continue for months, possibly years, but the foundation had been laid. Commander Thompson remained behind again, but this time his expression was entirely different. The skepticism had been replaced by something approaching awe. "In 15 years of leading SEALs, I've never seen anything like what just happened," he said quietly. "You didn't just help them, you reminded them who they are. You showed them that taking care of each other isn't just what they do in combat, it's who they are as human beings." Sarah packed her materials, deeply moved by what she had witnessed. "They did the hard work," she replied. "I just helped them remember that courage isn't the absence of fear or pain, it's facing those things together." That evening, for the first time since their return from deployment, the entire SEAL team gathered voluntarily for dinner. They told stories, shared memories of fallen friends, and began the long process of integrating their experiences into a narrative of service and sacrifice rather than trauma and loss. Sarah had seen many victories in her career, but watching these warriors choose healing over hiding, connection over isolation, ranked among her most meaningful achievements. The work was far from over, but the team had rediscovered something essential, the bonds that made them stronger than any individual could be alone. The emergency call came at 3 in the morning, jolting Sarah from deep sleep in her temporary quarters. Commander Thompson's voice on the phone was tight with controlled urgency, the tone she had learned to recognize when SEALs were shifting into crisis mode. "We need you at the base hospital immediately. There's been an incident." Sarah dressed quickly, her mind racing through possibilities. In her weeks working with the team, she had seen steady progress. The group sessions had become a source of strength rather than vulnerability, and individual therapy was yielding breakthrough after breakthrough. Johnson was sleeping through the night for the first time in months. Santos had gone 2 weeks without a panic attack. Kim had started attending anger management sessions voluntarily. The drive through the pre-dawn darkness of Coronado gave her time to prepare mentally for whatever awaited. She had learned that military crises often involved multiple layers of complexity, professional responsibilities, personal relationships, and institutional pressures, all colliding in ways that could destroy careers and lives. At the hospital, she found Commander Thompson packing outside the emergency room, his usual composed demeanor cracked with worry. Hospital Corpsman Chen stood nearby, still in her duty uniform, her face pale but determined. "It's Johnson," Thompson said without preamble. "He's physically fine, but—" He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man trained to communicate with precision and clarity. Chen filled in the details with the clinical efficiency that came from years of emergency medical training. He was found on the beach around midnight by base security. He was just sitting in the surf, fully clothed, staring at the horizon. When they approached him, he didn't respond. They had to physically guide him away from the water. Sarah's training immediately flagged the severity of the situation. A dissociative episode of that magnitude suggested Johnson had experienced some kind of psychological trigger that overwhelmed his developing coping mechanisms. The location, sitting in ocean waves that could easily have become dangerous, indicated a level of disconnection from reality that required immediate intervention. "Where is he now?" she asked, already moving toward the hospital entrance. "Observation room 3, Thompson replied. "The medical staff wanted to admit him for psychiatric evaluation, but I convinced them to wait for you. He keeps asking for his team." Inside the hospital, Sarah found Johnson sitting on an examination table, draped in a blanket that couldn't seem to warm him. His eyes held that thousand-yard stare she thought they had banished, but now it seemed deeper, more unreachable. When she entered the room, he looked up without really seeing her. "Tom was in the water," he said quietly, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone reporting facts without emotional connection. "I could hear him calling. I went to get him, but the water kept moving him farther away." Sarah understood immediately. Johnson had experienced what psychologists call an intrusive flashback, a moment when past trauma becomes so vivid that present reality dissolves entirely. He hadn't been sitting on a California beach. In his mind, he had been back in Afghanistan, trying to reach his fallen teammate. She pulled up a chair, positioning herself within his line of sight, but not so close as to feel threatening. Years of working with combat veterans had taught her that during episodes like this, the usual therapeutic approaches had to be modified. Johnson wasn't just remembering his trauma, he was reliving it. "Marcus, you're in California. You're at Naval Medical Center, San Diego. It's October 15th, 2023. She kept her voice steady and authoritative, providing anchoring information that could help him reorient to the present. He blinked slowly, some awareness flickering behind his eyes. "I know where I am," he said carefully. "But Tom," I left him again. "I was here, safe, warm, sleeping in a real bed while he's still." His voice trailed off as the full weight of survivor's guilt crashed over him. Sarah realized this wasn't just a random episode. Something had triggered the flashback, some stimulus that had overwhelmed the progress they had made. She needed to understand what had changed, what had pushed Johnson over the edge he had been walking so carefully. "What happened yesterday?" she asked gently. "Walk me through your day from the beginning." Johnson's recollection came in fragments, pieces of memory that revealed the complex web of emotions underlying his crisis. The team had been conducting routine training exercises, practicing insertion techniques they had performed hundreds of times. Everything had gone normally until the end of the day, when they received news that another SEAL team had lost a member in Syria, a young petty officer about the same age Tom Bradley had been. The notification had affected the entire team, but Johnson had internalized it differently. While his teammates saw it as a tragic reminder of their dangerous profession, Johnson experienced it as confirmation of his deepest fear, that he was somehow cursed to outlive better men, that his survival came at the cost of others' lives. "I started thinking about all the guys who didn't make it home," he continued, his voice growing stronger as he connected with the present moment. "Tom, Rodriguez from Team 6, Williams from Team 2, good operators who deserve to live more than I do." Sarah recognized the distorted thinking pattern immediately. Johnson had developed what therapists call survivor's hierarchy, a belief system where he ranked the worthiness of those who lived versus those who died, always placing himself at the bottom of the scale. "Marcus, look at me," she said firmly. "What you're feeling is understandable, but the thoughts you're having aren't true. Tom Bradley didn't die so you could live. Rodriguez and Williams didn't sacrifice themselves for you. Their deaths were tragedies, but they weren't transactions." She could see him struggling to process this concept, his military training warring with his emotional logic. SEALs were taught to think tactically, to analyze cause and effect, to find patterns and lessons in every mission. But trauma had corrupted this analytical ability, turning it into a weapon against his own self-worth. The hospital room door opened quietly, and Santos entered, followed by Kim and 3 other team members. They moved with the careful precision of operators entering potentially hostile territory, but their faces showed only concern for their teammate. "We heard what happened," Santos said simply. "Thought you might need backup." Sarah watched Johnson's reaction carefully. In her experience, the presence of team members during a psychological crisis could either provide crucial support or create additional pressure that made recovery more difficult. But as Johnson looked up at his teammates, some of the haunted expression left his eyes. "I'm okay," he said automatically, the reflexive response of someone trained never to admit weakness. Kim stepped closer, his own journey with emotional regulation evident in his careful approach. "No, you're not okay, and that's okay. We've all been there." It was a simple statement, but it carried profound meaning within military culture. Kim was acknowledging Johnson's struggle without minimizing it, offering support without implying weakness. More importantly, he was speaking from personal experience, having faced his own psychological battles in recent weeks. Santos nodded agreement. "Remember what Sarah taught us? We don't have to carry this stuff alone. That includes the bad nights, the flashbacks, the times when everything feels too heavy." Sarah observed this interaction with professional admiration and personal emotion. She was watching the therapeutic principles they had developed in group sessions being applied spontaneously by the team members themselves. They had internalized the lessons about mutual support and translated them into their own language of brotherhood and loyalty. Johnson looked around at his teammates, then back to Sarah. "I thought I was getting better. I thought I had this figured out." "Healing isn't linear," Sarah replied. "It's not a straight path from wounded to whole. You're going to have setbacks, difficult days, moments when the old pain feels fresh again. That doesn't mean you're not making progress. It means you're human." She gestured to the men surrounding them. "And it means you have people who understand what you're going through, people who won't let you face the bad days alone." The conversation that followed became an impromptu group therapy session in a hospital room at 4 in the morning. The team members shared their own recent struggles, their moments of doubt and episodes of being overwhelmed by memories. They talked about Tom Bradley not as a source of guilt, but as a reminder of what they were fighting to preserve, the bonds that made their sacrifices meaningful. Chen arrived with coffee and sandwiches, transforming the sterile medical environment into something more resembling a team briefing. Commander Thompson appeared in the doorway, having satisfied himself that his man was surrounded by appropriate support. As dawn broke over San Diego, Johnson was ready to return to his quarters. The crisis had passed, but more importantly, it had demonstrated something crucial about the team's developing resilience. They had faced a setback not as isolated individuals, but as a unified force capable of providing mutual aid under any circumstances. Sarah walked with them across the base as the morning watch began their duties. She reflected on how far they had all come, not just in individual healing, but in their understanding of what real strength looked like. They had learned that vulnerability wasn't the opposite of courage, it was another form of it. "Thank you," Johnson said as they reached the team quarters, "for coming out in the middle of the night, for not giving up on me when I gave up on myself." "That's what we do," Sarah replied. "We show up for each other." Commander Thompson, who had been walking slightly behind the group, stepped forward. His expression was thoughtful, almost reverent. "You know," he said quietly, "I've seen a lot of heroism in my career. Medal of Honor actions, impossible rescues, people doing extraordinary things under fire. But what I've watched happen over these past weeks, the courage it takes to face your own pain, to ask for help, to support each other through the hardest battles, that might be the most impressive thing I've ever witnessed." He paused, looking at Sarah with newfound respect. "And you've shown these warriors something I never could. You've shown them that healing is just another mission, one that requires the same dedication and teamwork as any combat operation." As Sarah prepared to leave for some much-needed rest, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. The team had faced their first major crisis since beginning therapy, and they had emerged stronger rather than more fragmented. The bonds they were building weren't just surviving the test of trauma, they were being strengthened by it. 3 months into her work at Coronado, Sarah received an invitation that both surprised and concerned her. Admiral Patricia Wells, commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command, requested a formal briefing on the therapeutic program that had been quietly transforming one of her SEAL teams. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the Admiral's conference room. a venue typically reserved for operational planning and strategic discussions. Sarah had heard about Admiral Wells through military channels, a decorated naval officer who had broken barriers as one of the first women to command Special Operations Forces. Her reputation was built on demanding excellence, innovative thinking, and an unwavering commitment to the welfare of the warriors under her command. The invitation suggested that word of the team's transformation had reached the highest levels of Navy leadership. Commander Thompson briefed Sarah on protocol and expectations as they prepared for the meeting. "The Admiral doesn't waste time on programs that don't produce results," he explained. "If she's asking for a brief, it means she's heard something significant. Be prepared for tough questions and direct challenges." The team members themselves had mixed reactions to news of the briefing. Johnson, who had become something of a spokesman for the therapeutic program, was cautiously optimistic. "If this helps other teams get the support they need, it's worth doing," he said. Santos worried about their private struggles becoming institutional case studies. Kim expressed concern about Sarah facing military bureaucracy without the protection of rank or position. "She's been looking out for us," he pointed out during an impromptu team discussion. "Maybe it's time we look out for her." The morning of the briefing, Sarah dressed carefully in her most professional civilian attire, aware that her appearance would be scrutinized as carefully as her words. She carried a folder containing statistical data on the team's progress, testimonials from team members, and recommendations for expanding the program to other units struggling with similar challenges. Admiral Wells' conference room was impressive in its understated efficiency. Maps of global operations covered one wall, while another displayed photographs of fallen warriors from various special operations units. The message was clear. Everything discussed in this room ultimately related to the lives and missions of elite military personnel. The Admiral herself was shorter than Sarah had expected, but her presence filled the room with quiet authority. She was accompanied by several staff officers, including a Navy psychologist, a chaplain, and a personnel officer whose roles Sarah couldn't immediately identify. "Dr. Martinez," Admiral Wells began, though Sarah had never claimed the doctoral title in military settings. "I've been receiving some interesting reports about your work with SEAL Team 5. Before we discuss expanding this program, I want to understand exactly what you've accomplished and how you've accomplished it." Sarah had prepared for this moment, but standing before senior military leadership felt different from any previous briefing she had given. She was acutely aware that her credibility depended entirely on results, not credentials or connections. "Admiral, 3 months ago, you had a SEAL team with 3 members exhibiting severe trauma symptoms that were affecting operational readiness," she began. "Today, those same men are not only functional but serving as peer counselors for other struggling service members. The transformation required no special resources, no additional personnel, just a different approach to addressing psychological wounds." She presented her data methodically. Decreased incident reports, improved performance evaluations, increased retention indicators, and positive peer assessments. But she knew numbers alone wouldn't capture what had really changed. The key breakthrough was helping the team understand that psychological resilience, like physical fitness, requires ongoing attention and mutual support. They approached their healing with the same tactical mindset they bring to combat operations, identifying objectives, developing strategies, executing plans, and adapting based on results. Admiral Wells leaned forward, her expression indicating intense interest. "You're saying you treated therapy like mission planning." "I'm saying they treated therapy like mission planning," Sarah corrected. "My role was to provide tools and frameworks. The warriors themselves did the work of developing psychological battle plans that fit their culture and operational requirements." The Navy psychologist interjected with questions about clinical protocols and evidence-based practices. Sarah answered thoroughly, demonstrating her familiarity with both traditional therapeutic approaches and the modifications necessary for special operations personnel. But she emphasized repeatedly that the program's success came from respecting military culture rather than trying to change it. "These men didn't need to become different people," she explained. "They needed to apply their existing strengths to challenges they hadn't been trained to face. The same courage that made them effective operators made them effective at supporting each other through psychological recovery." Admiral Wells asked pointed questions about scalability, sustainability, and resource requirements. She was particularly interested in the cost-benefit analysis, noting that retaining experienced operators was far more economical than training replacements from scratch. "What we're really discussing," the Admiral observed, "is a force multiplier. Psychologically resilient teams don't just perform better, they maintain their effectiveness longer, require less medical intervention, and retain institutional knowledge that takes years to develop." As the briefing progressed, Sarah found herself fielding questions that went far beyond her specific program. The military leadership was grappling with broader issues of warrior care, operational tempo, and the long-term sustainability of elite units. Her work with one SEAL team had apparently provided insights into challenges affecting the entire special operations community. The turning point in the meeting came when Admiral Wells asked about resistance to the program, both from team members and institutional leadership. Sarah answered honestly about the initial skepticism, the cultural barriers, and the ongoing challenges of changing attitudes toward psychological health care. "The biggest obstacle," she admitted, "wasn't convincing the warriors they needed help. It was convincing them they deserved help. Many of these men see seeking therapy as taking resources away from others who might need them more." Admiral Wells nodded slowly. "That matches other reports I've received. Our people are trained to put mission and teammates before personal needs. Sometimes that training works against their own recovery." The personnel officer, who had been taking notes throughout the briefing, asked about training requirements for military personnel who might implement similar programs. Sarah outlined the skills and experience necessary, emphasizing that successful therapists for special operations personnel needed both clinical expertise and deep understanding of military culture. "It's not enough to be a good counselor," she explained. "You have to earn their respect before they'll trust you with their vulnerabilities. That requires understanding what they've sacrificed and what they're fighting to protect." As the formal briefing concluded, Admiral Wells dismissed her staff officers but asked Sarah to remain. The one-on-one conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had expected. "I want to share something with you that doesn't leave this room," the Admiral said. "We've been struggling with increasing rates of suicide, PTSD, and retention problems across special operations. The traditional approaches aren't working, and we're losing too many good people to invisible wounds." She gestured toward the wall of photographs showing fallen warriors. "Some of those men and women died from enemy action, but too many died from battles they fought alone after they came home. Your program suggests there might be another way." Admiral Wells revealed that similar therapeutic approaches were being quietly tested with other units, with mixed results. The difference seemed to be the therapist's ability to connect with military culture and earn the respect of personnel who had been trained to be self-reliant. "What you've accomplished with Commander Thompson's team is remarkable," she continued. "But what interests me most is how you've maintained your effectiveness while operating outside the traditional military hierarchy. You have no rank, no commission, no formal authority, yet those SEALs follow your guidance like you're their commanding officer." Sarah considered her response carefully. "I think they follow my guidance because I never ask them to do anything that contradicts their values or training. I help them apply their existing strengths to new challenges, and I've shown them that I understand what they're fighting for." The Admiral stood and walked to the window overlooking the base, where small groups of personnel were conducting training exercises with the precision and intensity that characterized special operations. "I'm going to recommend that we expand this program to other SEAL teams and potentially to other special operations units," she said. "But I want you to know that your approach, respecting our culture while challenging our assumptions, has earned something that doesn't come easily in military circles." She turned back to face Sarah directly. "You've earned the respect of warriors who don't give their respect lightly. That's an achievement worth recognizing." As Sarah prepared to leave, Admiral Wells made a request that surprised her. "I'd like you to present your findings at the next Special Operations Medical Conference. Our medical personnel need to understand what you've learned about treating psychological wounds in ways that honor military culture." The meeting had exceeded Sarah's expectations in every way. What had begun as a briefing on one team's therapeutic program had evolved into discussions of systematic changes to how the military approached psychological health care. More importantly, she had gained the support of leadership who understood that innovation sometimes required thinking beyond traditional boundaries. Walking across the base afterward, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had started as an outsider trying to help three troubled warriors, and somehow found herself influencing policy discussions at the highest levels of military command. The transformation wasn't just in the men she had treated. It was in the institution's willingness to consider new approaches to old problems. That afternoon, she met with the SEAL team for their regular group session. When she told them about the Admiral's interest in expanding the program, their reactions were mixed but ultimately positive. "If this helps other teams avoid some of the pain we went through," Johnson said, "then sharing our story is just another way to serve." The real test would come in the days ahead, as the program moved from experimental to operational, from one team's private healing to a potential model for the entire special operations community. Document 5. The ceremony wasn't supposed to happen. Sarah had been preparing to conclude her work at Coronado with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the SEAL team she had worked with was not only functional but thriving. Her contract was ending, her report had been submitted, and Admiral Wells had approved the expansion of the therapeutic program to other units. By all measures, her mission had been accomplished. She was packing her office supplies when Hospital Corpsman Chen knocked on her door. "Sarah, you need to come with me," she said, her expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put Sarah on alert. "Is there a problem? Did something happen with one of the team members?" Chen shook her head. "No problems, but Commander Thompson wants to see you in the team briefing room. He says it's important." As they walked across the base, Sarah noticed an unusual amount of activity around the SEAL team's facilities. Personnel who weren't normally in that area seemed to be gravitating toward the building that housed the team's administrative offices and briefing rooms. She saw Admiral Wells' staff car in the parking area, along with vehicles belonging to other senior officers. "Chen, what's going on?" "You'll see," was all the medic would say, but Sarah caught the hint of a smile that Chen was trying to suppress. The briefing room had been transformed. Instead of the usual tactical maps and operational materials, the walls displayed photographs documenting the team's journey over the past 6 months. Pictures from their early, difficult days were contrasted with recent images showing relaxed, confident operators who had rediscovered their sense of purpose and brotherhood. The entire SEAL team was present, along with Commander Thompson, Admiral Wells, and a collection of senior officers Sarah recognized from her briefing weeks earlier. At the front of the room stood a small podium with a microphone, and beside it, a table covered with a military flag that concealed something underneath. Sarah's confusion deepened when she noticed that many of the people present were standing at a modified position of attention, not the rigid formality of a military formation, but the respectful alertness that characterized important ceremonies. Commander Thompson stepped to the podium, his expression more serious than Sarah had seen since their first difficult meeting months earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to recognize someone who has served with distinction, though not in the traditional sense of military service." His voice carried the formal tone reserved for significant occasions. "Dr. Sarah Martinez came to us as an outsider, a civilian contractor brought in to address what we frankly considered an institutional problem that required an institutional solution." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment as Thompson continued. She had never sought recognition for her work, finding satisfaction in the quiet success of helping warriors heal. But as she looked around the room at the faces of men who had struggled through their darkest moments, she realized this ceremony wasn't really about her. "What we discovered," Thompson continued, "was that sometimes the most military solution isn't the one that comes from within military culture. Sometimes it requires someone who can see our strengths from the outside and help us apply those strengths to battles we weren't trained to fight." He gestured toward the team members, who stood together with the quiet confidence that marked their transformation. "6 months ago, 3 of my men were struggling with psychological wounds that threatened not just their careers, but their lives. Traditional military medicine had reached its limits. We were facing the real possibility of losing some of our best operators to invisible injuries." Sarah watched Johnson, Santos, and Kim as Thompson spoke. They stood straighter now, not with the rigid posture of men trying to hide their pain, but with the natural confidence of warriors who had faced their demons and emerged stronger. Their transformation was evident not just in their bearing, but in their eyes, alert and engaged rather than haunted and distant. Dr. Martinez didn't just treat symptoms, Thompson continued. She taught us that psychological resilience could be approached with the same tactical precision we bring to combat operations. She showed us that seeking help wasn't weakness, it was another form of courage. Admiral Wells stepped forward to join Thompson at the podium. Her presence elevated the ceremony from a team recognition to something with institutional significance. In my 30 years of military service, the Admiral began, I've learned that real leadership often comes from unexpected sources. Sometimes the person who sees the solution most clearly is the one standing outside the problem, looking in with fresh eyes and an open heart. She turned to address Sarah directly. Your work with SEAL Team 5 has implications far beyond this one unit. You've demonstrated that effective therapy for special operations personnel requires not just clinical expertise, but deep respect for military culture and values. Your approach is being studied and adapted across our entire special operations community. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the formality and attention, but she also sensed that something more significant was happening. This wasn't just recognition for her individual contributions. It was acknowledgement of a different way of thinking about warrior care and psychological health. Santos stepped forward from the group of team members. Ma'am, if I may. He looked to Admiral Wells for permission to speak, which she granted with a nod. 6 months ago, I was having panic attacks that made it impossible to do my job effectively, he said, his voice clear and steady. I thought my career was over, that I'd let down my team and my country. Dr. Martinez didn't just help me manage my symptoms. She helped me understand that my struggles didn't diminish my value as a warrior. Kim joined him. She taught us that taking care of each other includes taking care of our psychological health, that supporting a teammate through trauma is as important as any combat mission. She showed us how to be better SEALs by being better human beings. Johnson, who had been quiet throughout the ceremony, stepped forward last. Most importantly, she never made us feel broken or weak. She treated our psychological wounds with the same respect and professionalism that medical personnel show to physical injuries. She understood that we're warriors first, and she helped us heal as warriors. Commander Thompson returned to the podium and lifted the flag from the table, revealing a framed certificate and a small wooden plaque. Sarah couldn't read the details from where she stood, but she could see that both items bore official military seals and formal calligraphy. Dr. Martinez, by direction of the Commanding General, Naval Special Warfare Command, and with the approval of the Chief of Naval Operations, you are hereby awarded the Navy Civilian Service Achievement Medal for exceptional performance in developing and implementing innovative therapeutic protocols for special operations personnel. The citation was read formally, detailing her contributions to warrior care and the potential impact of her work on future military psychological health programs. But Sarah found herself focusing less on the formal recognition and more on the faces of the men she had worked with, seeing in them the real measure of her success. As the ceremony continued, Admiral Wells presented the award and spoke about the broader implications of Sarah's work. But it was what happened next that would remain with Sarah long after the official proceedings ended. Commander Thompson called the team to attention, not the mechanical precision of parade formations, but the focused respect that elite units reserve for their most solemn moments. And then, in a gesture that broke every rule of military protocol, he turned toward Sarah and raised his hand in a crisp, perfect salute. The action was immediately mirrored by every person in uniform in the room. Admiral Wells, with 3 decades of distinguished service, the team members who had fought through their darkest moments, the staff officers who had initially questioned bringing in civilian help, all of them rendering honors to someone who had never worn a uniform, held a commission, or sworn an oath of military service. The salute wasn't about rank or position or institutional hierarchy. It was about respect, the deep, earned respect that warriors give to those who have proven themselves worthy of trust in the most difficult circumstances. Sarah had served alongside them not in combat, but in the equally challenging battle for psychological healing and recovery. As the salutes were held, Sarah felt the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just recognition for her professional achievements. It was acknowledgement that she had become part of something larger than herself, that her civilian expertise had been welcomed into the brotherhood of those who serve. When the salutes were finally lowered, the formal ceremony dissolved into something more personal. Team members approached to shake her hand, to share final thoughts, to express gratitude that went beyond professional courtesy. These were warriors who didn't give their trust easily, but once given, that trust was absolute. Admiral Wells was among the last to speak with Sarah privately. "You should know that your approach is already being implemented at 3 other bases," she said. "We're training military psychologists in the techniques you developed, and we're recruiting civilian therapists with similar backgrounds and understanding." She paused, then added something that surprised Sarah. "But more than that, you've reminded us that sometimes the best way to honor military tradition is to adapt it when circumstances require new solutions. You've shown us that strength comes in many forms, including the courage to ask for help and the wisdom to provide it effectively." As the crowd dispersed, and Sarah prepared to leave Coronado for the final time, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. She had come to treat 3 struggling SEALs and ended up influencing policy at the highest levels of military command. More importantly, she had helped warriors rediscover their strength and had been honored to witness their transformation. Walking across the base one last time, Sarah passed groups of personnel conducting training exercises, preparing for missions that would test their skills and courage in ways she could barely imagine. But now she understood something she hadn't fully grasped when she first arrived. The strength that made them effective in combat was the same strength that would help them heal from its aftermath. The salute from Commander Thompson and his team would remain one of the most meaningful moments of her career, not because of its military significance, but because of what it represented. She had been accepted not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who understood that serving others could take many forms, all of them worthy of honor and respect. The real victory wasn't in the award or the recognition or even the expansion of her therapeutic program. It was in knowing that warriors who had once fought their battles alone now faced their challenges together, stronger for having learned that courage includes the willingness to heal.